Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RAF Museum's Research Lectures. I'm the museum's historian, Dr. Harry Rafal, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Michael Terry, who's going to speak on the final fight of Werner Voss and its role in RFC mythology. And I should say at the beginning, I'm not going to try and repeat that title too many times because it's deliberately designed to trip me up into a lisp. But can I say welcome to all of you first before I introduce our speaker? It's a real delight to have such a global audience joining us today. We have people joining us from Saskatoon, Santiago, and even South Shields. So wherever you are joining us from, welcome. It's a delight to have you with us. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Michael Terry, who is a doctoral researcher at the Open University, and he is writing a thesis on First World War aerial combat in literature. And his work aims to highlight the significance of this under-researched body of writing. And he examines how this literature is highly distinct and confounds our expectations of what First World literature should look like, and indeed how this literature has shaped a mythology around early aerial combat that endures today. Now, though Michael does a lot within history, he is primarily an English specialist, so it's really a delight to have some interdisciplinary research today. And I think looking at the sources that Michael uses and his approach, there's a lot of overlap with history, which probably shows the benefit of collaborations in these disciplines. And indeed, he presented as a 2021 entrant to the British Commission for Military History's 3-minute thesis. So it's nice to be able to plug the BCMH as well, because they do a lot to promote our lecture series and our conferences. So, Michael, I'm delighted to have you speak on this topic, which I won't repeat the title of again. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Harry, and good evening to everyone. So just to set some of the background of what I'm doing here, like Harry said, I'm primarily an English literature student and researcher rather than a historian, but I'm approaching a very historical topic here, and this is a chance for me to show how the crossover between literature and history can work. And I've chosen what in historical terms is actually quite a famous incident, this final fight of Werner Voss. It may be that you know quite a lot about this fight already. It may be that you know absolutely nothing about it at all. But I'm hoping either way, my presentation has something to add and to show why my research has the angle that it does. And I'm willing to engage all sorts of levels on this, but just to let you know, if you want to ask me any questions after the presentation, I'm very happy to answer any questions at all. But just bear in mind that I don't have any new historical insight on the fight. If you ask me about something that happened in the fight, I will give you my opinion based on the sources that I've read about. But I can't magically come up with some new truth. That's not really how my work works. If you want to ask me more broadly about any aspect of my work, anything to do with First World War literature, I'm very happy to do that as well. So I'm willing to engage with answering questions in a very broad sense. Well, I think I may as well get going at that point because my first slide will actually talk a little bit about my work. So the final fight of Werner Voss and its role in RFC mythology. Some of my details down the bottom there. We'll return to those again later. So before I get going, I just want to speak a little bit about my work. Now we've got a Biggles slide on the left there. This presentation has nothing to do with Biggles, but Biggles has a lot to do with my work. So what is it actually that I research? Well, as we said, I'm looking at the representation of aerial combat in First World War literature. Now, when I say literature, I don't just mean books like Biggles, although obviously I do work with books quite a lot, but any form of literature relating to First World War aerial combat, whether that's written by the airmen themselves or people around the airmen, and the way in which people constructed that war in writing. So it might be a book, it might be a diary, it might be newspaper reports, it might be combat reports. I've read hundreds of combat reports. And I'm trying to see how did these people construct their war. And the reason this is important is that the First World War, particularly in British culture, is a very literary war. It's a war we understand primarily through the medium of literature. Unlike, for example, the Second World War, which we might say in popular representation is probably best known through film. The First World War is very much about books, to the point where a number of historians are concerned about the influence of literature on our understanding of the First World War, because the First World War literary canon tends to concentrate on cynical, disillusioned, or the word I've heard, disenchanted representations of that war, focusing on ideas like the death and the futility and the bad generals and the overall pointlessness of the whole thing. This has led to, over the last few decades, some very intense studies of the literature of the First World War to try and work out what this literature meant, why it was written, why it's developed that way, and if it doesn't quite line up with the history, the question is then, why does it not quite line up? How can we look into this mythology? But for some reason, aerial literature, stuff written about aerial combat, has been almost entirely excluded from this study. It's been ignored. It is not a form of literature that is widely studied. Even though the person who basically started this discipline, a man called Paul Fussell, wrote in his starting book that he didn't think the air war was important. He specifically said, I'm going to concentrate on the trenches, the air war is irrelevant. And people over time have written what we might say many responses to Fussell, criticizing various areas of his methodology, even the kind of people he was focusing on and what his work should actually mean. But no one has ever really picked up the idea that aerial combat representation is important. And it is important because, like I said, most First World War literature is associated with the cynical and the downbeat and the disenchanted, but not aerial combat literature. And that's why I've got the bigger slide up, because the closest we've got to a canon of First World War aerial literature is the Biggles books. And they're not disenchanted at all. They are adventure stories. They are very positive and upbeat and very related to areas of sportsmanship and enjoyment and masculine ideals and that kind of thing. And so we have this very distinct, diverse body of literature. And with people racking their brains trying to find out, why do we normally understand the First World War in this cynical and disillusioned way? Well, I think it's very relevant to study the major exception to that, because I think that will give us insight onto how the whole question of how we remember the First World War, particularly in Britain, and we can try and work that out. And there's all sorts of interesting areas I get into along the way. So what I'm really doing today, I'm using this famous fight as a case study to show you an example, really, of how my work works. So I'm just going to start off by saying what this is and what this is not. First of all, this is not a blow-by-blow account of the fight. There's several reasons why it's not that. First of all, it would take too long. Secondly, there isn't actually one single agreed definition of what happened in the fight. It was a very, very confused experience. So to do a whole presentation trying to give an accurate presentation of that fight would be somewhat of a waste. But really, the actual details of what happened in the fight are not what I am focusing on. I'm more interested in how that fight was represented and how that has translated to a later form of mythology. And when I say represented, by the way, I'm meaning any way in which people try and tell you in which it happens. But of course, in this case, that's almost all writing. So when I say represented, I mean how it was written about. Now, again, even if I cut it down to just how it's represented, there's more material here than I could possibly put into one presentation. So I'm focusing primarily on two of the major British combatants in the fight. First of all, James McCudden, one of the most famous British aces of the war, possibly the greatest British ace of the war. Man is already famous in aerial circles for many reasons. But also Arthur Rhys-Davids, so you're more likely to have heard of if you're more of a specialist in this area. Arthur Rhys-Davids was a very, very accomplished ace, a very fast scorer in air combat. He would have become much more famous, except he died just when he was doing very, very well. He died very young, very early on, but he's very important to this fight. So what I'm going to be doing, I am going to talk about the fight. I'm then going to examine how the fight came together and how it was written about afterwards. I'm going to explore the mythology. I'm going to trace how it developed, first of all, in the war itself. Secondly, in the 1930s, which is really the time where most of the basis for aerial mythology gets established. Certainly the aerial publication industry picks off them, which is when we get back to Biggles. And then I'm going to look at how it's often been represented in the modern day. When I say the modern day, I'm actually talking about the last 30 years or so, really in what we might call modern history. But the main objective of the presentation is to examine the role this Voss fight plays as this significant moment in the whole modern construction of aerial combat, especially early aerial combat, and our modern idea of the fighter pilot, a lot of which really stems out from these early days in the First World War. So let's start going through some of the important factors here. Let's start with Werner Voss himself. Clearly, you'd think he'd be the most important person here, but one of the things I'm going to talk about later is that we don't really know as much about Werner Voss as we'd really like. Well, nonetheless, let's have a look at some of the basic facts. Born on the 13th of April, 1897. One of the stars of the German Air Force. He'd been a fighter pilot since November 1916, and that's really the time when the Germans really started making dedicated fighter squadrons. He's awarded the Blue Max. You can see that around his neck in that picture there, which was the highest order of merit given by the Kingdom of Prussia, because there wasn't really a unified German system for medals, but it's very strongly associated with the top German aces during the war. They got the Blue Max, basically for getting a predetermined number of kills. The amount of kills they needed went up and up as the war went along. But basically, if you're wearing a Blue Max, you were one of the super elite of the German Air Force. So in September 1917, which is the time we're looking at, he was just 20 years old. He was Staffelführer. It's effectively the same thing as squadron commander of Jaster 10, that's the German fighter squadron, which was in turn part of the famous Flying Circus, a group of squadrons under the command of Manfred von Richthofen, who will later be known, much later, will be known as the Red Baron. And just an example of how important Werner Voss was, the plane he was flying was a Fokker triplane, like the red triplane of the Red Baron, probably the most famous sort of plane of the war. A lot of imagery related to that. Well, he was only the second pilot on the Western Front to be given one of those triplanes. The first, of course, was Richthofen himself. So that's an indication of just how significant Werner Voss was in the German setup. So, on 23rd of September 1917, it's a busy day on the Western Front. We are in the midst here of the Battle of Passchendaele. Voss had a busy day. He's already shot down one plane in the morning. That's his 48th and final accredited victory. He spends the afternoon with his two brothers. We have a picture there. That's Werner Voss in the middle. His brothers flanking him. That's the last picture ever taken of Werner Voss alive. He takes off in the evening. Now, he's the squadron commander. He's not really necessarily meant to be flying about on his own. And indeed, he takes off immediately with two other of his men. And there are other members of his squadron who flew off behind him. But the thing about that triplane, it's not a super plane. It's not like some sort of wonder weapon, but it has its advantages. And one thing a triplane can certainly do, it could climb a lot better than the German planes of his comrades. And Voss uses that climbing power. He gets ahead of the rest of his squadron, and he ends up going into the battle area alone. And he ends up near Polkapel, so a few miles from Ypres, and that's how central we are looking here in these battle zones. He's at Ypres, one of the most iconic places in the whole First World War canon. So at 6:25, roughly, you can only guess at some of the times here, Voss engages two fighters from 60 Squadron. He does a very capable attack. He triples one and drives the other away. However, in the course of doing this attack, Voss has been spotted by SE-5A fighters of 56 Squadron, which was the British elite squadron carrying some of its best pilots. And they moved into attack to try and rescue their friends. So we're going to take a quick look at two of the people involved there. The first is James McCudden. Now, James McCudden is one sort of ace. He's born 1895. His distinct thing is that he was in flying before the First World War started. He was a mechanic. He was an enlisted man. And during the course of the war, he first became an observer. Then he learned to fly, became a pilot, and he was commissioned an officer. So he really came in from the bottom upwards. And he went on to become one of the greatest British aces of the war, 57 victories, military medal, and military cross. Not many people that get both the medal and the cross, because the military medal is only for enlisted men, and the military cross is generally only for officers. The medal, the cross, and bar, a Distinguished Service Order, and bar, and a Victoria Cross. So you got the greatest one of them all. But at this point, age 22, he's B Flight leader in 56 Squadron. It's early in his career. He's not a legend yet. He has 12 accredited victories. He has the military medal and a military cross. Also in his flight, we have this striking picture there of Arthur Rhys Davids, born 1897. Now, if you're thinking of a kind of cliche of the First World War fighter pilots as a kind of like privileged public schoolboy. Rhys Davids is very close to that kind of cliche that he was from Eton College, though he got there on a scholarship, which is slightly different. And he could have gone on to go to Oxford, but then the war came along and he joined the Royal Flying Corps. He's not, unlike McCudden, Rhys Davids has not been flying very long. He's only been doing combat missions for a few months, but he's very quickly established himself as a phenomenon. He's only 19 years old. 18 months early, he was still school captain at Eton, but now he's one of the rising stars of the Royal Flying Corps on the front line. I have a quote here from McCudden about Rhys Davids at this time. If one was ever over the salient in the autumn of 1917 and saw an SE5 fighting like hell amongst a heap of Huns, one would find 9 times out of 10 that the SE was flown by Rhys Davids. So, this is the kind of quality of people that Voss has run into trouble against, some of the greatest pilots in the Royal Flying Corps. So I'm going to talk a bit about the battle, about how far as we can tell what happened in that fight. So, first of all, he's attacked by 4 members of B Flight. Later in the fight, elements of C Flight join in. We're a bit confused about the continuity of what happened when, but we think about 7 planes attacked Voss during the course of the fight. Probably at one point 6 people attacking him at once. He's completely outnumbered. And this is where the legend begins, because he fights those planes for 10 minutes. He puts on this spectacular display of fighting skill, fighting them all off. 2 of his attackers come so badly damaged during the fight, they had to withdraw. And so at least one of the planes was a write-off, and he damaged several more. So this is obviously an amazing experience for this one pilot to hold off at least half a dozen opponents, and not half a dozen novices, half a dozen experts. Now, when I say solo, it's a beta in the Western Front. It can't just be entirely alone. At some point during the fight, a Albatross fighter described as having a red nose tries to help Voss. There's been arguments over time about who the pilot was. It was driven off, and Rhys Davids shot down a red-nosed plane shortly after the battle, which for a long time was thought to be the same plane. We're not quite sure, and I hope you're guessing the idea here. There's always a lot of uncertainty about what was going on. Why was Voss left alone for so long? Well, there were other German planes in the area, but there were other British planes in the area as well, and it looks like no one was really feeling determined enough to go and interfere. So Voss was left fighting on his own against all of these British planes. Now, what I have here are some depictions of the moments of the fight given by the people in it. Now, some of these depictions were written much later, so we have to bear that in mind. But first of all, here we have Verschoy Cronin. I'm afraid that's the best picture I can find of him. It's not a very good quality one, I know. Let's have a look at what he said. I take my hat off to that Hun, as he was a most skillful pilot. He whipped around in an extraordinary way, using no bank at all, but throwing his tail behind him. When he says no bank at all, normally when a First World War plane turns, it has to lean to one side first so it can maneuver in that direction. But he's saying that Voss was just throwing his tail behind him, just spinning on the spot. I was doing like a 180 spin and flying immediately in the other direction. It's a very strange thing for a First World War plane to do, but it's just as goes to show that Voss seemed to be pulling these amazing moves that these guys couldn't work out. The Hun was making no attempt to escape, and what is more, he was holding his own against very uneven odds. And this is Geoffrey Bowman also writing later. Voss could have got away had he wished to, but he was not that type. And there's a lot of this focus on Voss deliberately not getting away. He appeared to take flying liberties with impunity. To my amazement, he kicked on full rudder without bank, so again, without leaning to one side first, and gave me a burst whilst he was skidding sideways, and then kicked on the opposite rudder before the effects of this amazing stunt appeared to have any effect on the controllability of his machine. But the primary and the best depiction of the fight came from James McCudden himself, who is always an interesting and engaging writer. And he described the start of the fight. The German pilot saw us and turned in a most disconcertingly quick manner, a sort of flat half spin. Its handling was marvelous to behold. The pilot seemed to be firing at all of us simultaneously. And he gives later this other striking image from the battle. At one time, I noted the triplane in the apex of a cone of bullets from at least 5 machines simultaneously. So, it's almost like a scene out of an action movie. They're describing these incredible sights. And McCudden is describing this much closer to the actual time of the fight than the other two. Now, of course, it couldn't go on forever. At some point in the fight, Voss's plane seemed to stop maneuvering, and it was at a point where Rhys Davids was nearby. And Rhys-Davids made several attacks at close range before he finally overshot on one of them and lost track of where Voss was. Now, we're really not sure quite what happened. We don't know if Voss was already wounded, or his plane was damaged, or he was out of ammunition, or if he was looking for somewhere to land. We can't know. But for some reason, Voss's manoeuvre stopped, and that gave Rhys-Davids a chance to move in. And McCudden described the end. I noticed that the triplane's movements were very erratic, and then I saw him go into a fairly steep dive. I saw the triplane hit the ground and disappear into 1,000 fragments. Rhys-Davids was given credit for shooting down Voss. We can talk about if we can query that later, but he got the credit at the time. Voss's body was found the next day. It wasn't his plane that was in trouble. It was him. He'd been shot through the chest and abdomen. He was very roughly buried at the time. After the war, his body could not be found. The wreck of his plane was stripped. Voss is memorialized today in the absence of his body at the Langemarck German War Cemetery. You see there his name inscribed there on a memorial. So that's the fight. Well, let's take a moment to look at that fight with a cynical eye, because there's many ways in which the fight was incredible, but there's many ways when we're looking at it as a serious piece of history that we have to consider. So first of all, Voss should not have been caught out alone. No fighter pilot had any business at that point in the war being caught alone against half a dozen opponents. That's not a position you should get into. Why wasn't he with his teammates? Why had he outpaced them? These were all mistakes. And the odds were unbeatable. There was no realistic chance of Voss prevailing. One playing against that many expert opponents, sooner or later, one of them was going to get him. If he really did have chances to escape during the fight, like we saw that Cronin and Bowman both fought, it was very foolish not to have taken them, because that was the best way out for Voss. It was to get clear. There's a number of reasons why it might have been harder for him to escape than those people thought, but nonetheless, it's sometimes been taken as some sort of badge of honor that he didn't escape, whereas you, from a different point of view, you might say it was quite stupid. And there's another thing to consider. Voss didn't achieve anything. He didn't shoot down any British pilots during the fight. He damaged their planes, some of them badly, but they were all repaired or replaced. So he didn't get anything out of it. And in a broader sense, we're in the middle of the Battle of Passchendaele, the third Battle of Ypres. What difference did any of this fighting make to the Battle of Passchendaele? Absolutely nothing at all. If you're looking for important things that happened on the 23rd of September 1917 on the Western Front, there are far more important things than this fight. And yet, this fight is one of the best remembered moments of the First World War in total, and specifically, possibly the best remembered aerial combat of the First World War. So, let's have a look at how this mythology developed. Well, it starts off almost immediately as soon as the 56th Squadron pilots got home. Now, bear in mind again, they didn't immediately write down what they thought. These are all later recollections of how they felt afterwards. And we'll start with McCudden. We arrived back at the mess, and at dinner, the main topic was the wonderful fight. We all conjectured that the enemy pilot must be one of the enemy's best. Of course, they didn't know it was Voss. It's not as if he was identifying himself. And we debated as to whether it was Richthofen or Wolf or Voss. Cronin said after the war that during the discussion at dinner, we somewhat theatrically stood and toasted a very courageous and tenacious fighter who could have disengaged himself from the combat at any time. So there again, we have this idea that Voss could have got away. But already, the focus on the fight is just how skillful and how brilliant Voss was. This is the foundation of the legend. And then what did Bowman have to say about how it was just afterwards? Well, he's slightly different. He says our relation was not nearly as great as you might have imagined. It was an amazing show on the part of Voss, so that bit's the same. I remember at the time feeling rather sorry it had to end the way it did. And Rhys-Davids, I think, was genuinely upset. And this is an interesting sentiment, this idea that it had to end the way that it did. And so now we have here, and I've put it in bold, because this is possibly, for the mythology, the most important line. This line that's attributed to Rhys-Davids, "Oh, if I could only have brought him down alive." They wanted, in this version, to have taken Voss alive. That would have been the perfect ending to the battle, this very sort of sentimental or chivalric kind of position, that it's a shame that Voss had to die. So that's how it starts, but at this point, of course, it's only known to pilots. What did Rhys-Davids and McCudden say when they were thinking about it afterwards? Well, Rhys-Davids never wrote a memoir, unfortunately, but he was quite expressive in some of his letters. In one of his letters to his mother, he wrote, "My hat! He was equally a brave man and a brilliant pilot." And he's even more expressive in another letter to one of his sisters. My God, he was a brave man, and what is more, an absolutely wonderful scrapper. I take my mental hat off to him. Something to do with Rhys Davidson hat. He likes using hat metaphors here. But McCudden has the most famous description of the fight, to the one that's most often quoted, and this very, very expressive thing from McCudden in his memoir to an enemy in the First World War, whilst the First World War is still going. This extraordinary comment. As long as I live, I shall never forget my admiration for that German pilot who single-handedly fought 7 of us for 10 minutes and also put some bullets through all of our machines. His flying was wonderful, his courage magnificent, and in my opinion, he is the bravest German airman whom it has been my privilege to see fight. So here we have these foundations of the mythology based around the brilliance of Voss. Now, slowly it starts to get out into the press. Now, I've got 2 comparative articles here, one from 1917, one from 1918. The 1917 articles in places like the Times and the Daily Mail pitched at a duel between Rhys Davids and Voss. But as the British press at the time wasn't allowed to name British pilots, Rhys Davids was never actually named. So you see, they're talking about it as a duel. The Times talks it's a duel between a triplane and one of our machines, and it tries to make the fight sound as exciting as possible. This close combat that they miss colliding with each other's wings by inches. The Daily Mail focused on a kind of chivalric interpretation by talking about the usual courtesies of the air have been observed in telling the Germans of the end of their skilled and courageous duelist. Now, sometimes the impression is given that the First World War press was full of chivalric and knightly descriptions of First World War combat. It really wasn't. But the Daily Mail here is touching on the chivalrous idea by talking about informing the Germans of Voss's death. Usual courtesies is an exaggeration. This was not commonly done. But skilled and courageous duelists. This is in the Daily Mail, in the press, praising an enemy. It's quite extraordinary. By July 1918, the Daily Mail was now publishing an account of the fight by McCudden, which now made it out that it was Voss fighting against a group. Rhys Davids still not named, but at least he can be called RD in that fight. And so by the end of the war, this idea of like Voss, and we see at the top right, Voss's last fight, very similar to what I've called my presentation, the final fight of Werner Voss. It's already become known in this way. But it's not yet a legend. It doesn't quite become this sort of legend until there's an examination of the representation of the First World War aerial combat in the 1930s. Now, what you have to remember about the 1930s is that there was an obsession with things based in the air. For example, the annual air display at Hendon Airfield had more people coming to it every year than people that went to the FA Cup final or went to Ascot or any major event like that. It was tremendously popular. These days, air flying is very ordinary. Back then, it was still considered amazing, something that most people in the world had not done. Flying was still there. And people were very interested in flying. They were interested in its past and its present and its future. And this first piece of literature I'm looking at here is an example of that sort of like mania about things air related. 1936 book called War in the Air, Magnificent Wonders of Our Time. 800 pages long. This enormous book. And that's the kind of interest people had, that they buy something like this. And let's see how they depicted this fight. And you can see we've got this picture of Rhys Davids on the left. That's a portrait by William Orpen. And have a look at the caption there. He's called Magnificent Fighter. And he's set against, on the right, there's a picture of Werner Voss. And Voss is called Worthy Foe. I'm always very interested in the particular words that we use in literature to describe things. And have a look at that opposition, the magnificent fighter against the worthy foe. And think about the importance of the worthy foe narrative, because how can you have a magnificent fighter if he doesn't have a worthy foe to fight? Like any good action movie, the hero needs a decent antagonist to fight against, otherwise what's the point? So Voss is vital to this story, and this is really where a lot of the focus was in the 30s. It focused on Rhys Davids as the person who beat Voss, the magnificent fighter, and the worthy foe. And if you can make out the caption down the bottom right, I've also put it in the main text there. There's an interesting use of language here, which I'll come back to later. But it says there that Voss met his conqueror in Lieutenant Rhys Davids, not his killer. Notice that, his conqueror. We'll come back later to this nervousness a lot of these representations have in talking about killing in aerial combat. So let's have a look at some other 1930s literature from Voss. For example, Volume 4 of The War in the Air, by H.A. Jones. Now, Jones is the official historian for the RAF. He's writing, this is not some amateur effort, this is the actual official history, and he includes the Voss fight. I've got the extract here. It became apparent that Voss had exceptional skill and courage. He fought 7 opponents for some time, single-handed. For some time, the fight was waged fiercely, with the Fokker triplane dazzlingly elusive. It's a very evocative fight to go in the official history. Incidentally, Bowman took objection to that dazzlingly elusive line. He thought it implied that Voss was just dodging all the time. His point was, no, Voss wasn't elusive, Voss was deadly. But nonetheless, this is how it got represented. The fighter ace William McClanahan in 1936 has a different angle. Now, this sort of thing came out a lot. Germans worked on a cold philosophy, a cruel one that required officers to drive their men onwards at the point of the revolver. Very common view of the German war machine is that it was a machine and all the people were just parts in the machine. But now look, only outstanding pilots such as Voss and Boelcke possessed a spirit that could lift them above the machine of which they're supposed to be part. So this idealization of Voss is growing not just in the public, but amongst fighter pilots. And likewise, here's the probably the best description in the 30s by Ira Jones in 1934. The chivalrous, brave, and resourceful Voss. Chivalrous, brave, and resourceful. Voss it was who, in a triplane, fought the most daring air battle of all time. He recalls the end of Lancelot. His lifeblood was streaming from him, but this brave, daring spirit refused to yield. So we can see by this point, we're already in very mythological terms when we're talking about this fight in the 1930s. And we've got these chivalric angles coming in, this admiration for Voss. And I say it's the worthy foe narrative against the idea of the magnificent fighter. Now, if we wind it forwards to the last few decades, we have several different angles on the fights, but some of it started to shift. So if you look at Piet Hein Meijering in 1988 in his book Signed with Their Honor, now Meijering very much brought into the idea of aerial chivalry. So here we just have a developing narrative. The death of a gallant adversary will bring no feelings of joy to the heart of a chivalrous fighter. And he thinks that Werner Voss is one of the main examples of someone that in terms of chivalry, it was a shame he had to die. So that part of the mythology has survived to the modern day. But there's other things people are looking at. So John Morrow, Great War in the Air, 1993. In a truly epic encounter, he describes it, Voss fought them all for 10 minutes, putting bullets in all their craft before one of them, Arthur Rhys Davids, managed to bring him down. So there's the chivalry, there's the amazing nature of the fight. Barry Diggins, one of the primary historians of the fight I'm talking about here, in 2003, Voss never shunned a fight. He was reckless and impetuous in action, thought nothing of taking overwhelming odds, and consistently got away with it. This audacious behavior was to earn in the respect of friend and foe alike. So this admiration for Voss has also survived to the modern day. And I included one extra quote here from O'Brien Brown in Aviation History, July 2003. Voss was to fight his last battle, a 10-minute confrontation that is counted amongst the greatest aerial encounters of World War I, and one of the most spectacular battles in the history of air warfare. I've included that quote because it is 70 years since Ira Jones said almost exactly the same thing about this being one of the most spectacular battles, one of the greatest battles in the history of aerial warfare. So all of this has survived forwards. Now, of course, this means that Voss has attracted a lot of professional historical attention, and there are historians who know much more about the air war as a piece of history, much more than me, who have looked at this in detail. They've covered the fight as best they can from start to finish, and they've often raised a number of questions, some of which I've brought up. Why did Voss leave the protection of his comrades? Why did he let himself get caught in this dangerous situation? Why did he not try to escape? Was it possible for him to escape? Some people said he was, but it's not really as easy as people seem. Was he wounded, or is playing cool at the point Rhys Davids attacked? Which leads on to the next point. Does Rhys Davids really deserve the credit for shooting him down? Voss had almost certainly taken bullets from other planes as well. There's even arguments about little details like where are various parts of Voss's plane? It was stripped at the time, but people have looked for artifacts of this fight because mythology needs its artifacts. Things like its compass or its rudder. Now, the rudder is meant to be up in the, at times it's been in the Imperial War Museum, but there's a debate whether that's actually the right rudder or not. So that's the kind of level we get to. The last question there is probably the one that most crosses over with my area. Was Rhys Davids a hypocrite for saying he wanted to take Voss alive? We'll come back to that in a bit. But you see how the history has comprehensively examined this fight to the point where we're caught up in these little details we can't really resolve. There's no way we're ever going to get a 100% accurate point of the fight. I say it's been extensively covered in the history. But rather than just history, I want to look also at how it's covered in a more popular sense. So we start here with Ralph Barker, whose book, The War Flying Corps World War One, is kind of halfway between being a historical text and a kind of like a personal comment on the air war. The chivalry so often ascribed to World War One pilots scarcely extended to adhesive combat, but admiration for a fallen enemy did. It was Rhys Davids himself who expressed a general regret at the death of Werner Voss, and there's that quote that I highlighted earlier. Oh, if I could only have brought him down alive. And now to be a bit more modern, here's a blog. There's lots of blogs you'll find out there dealing with things like Werner Voss. If we look, but this one is by the Canadian educator Donald Ward. In recently is 2020. Rhys Davids, who himself fell in combat 1 month later, said to McCudden, if I could only have brought him down alive. And then let's take us up to date. This is today, the Wikipedia Werner Voss article. Now, heaven forbid that I should try and use Wikipedia as a historical source. Of course, I'm not doing that. I'm using it as a representation of how popular culture is represented. In its Werner Voss article, it has this line, the pilot who actually killed Voss, Arthur Rhys Davids, wished he had brought him down alive. And that's not buried in the article, it's in the lead, it's at the top. So we keep seeing in popular representations in the modern day the focus on this Rhys Davids line about bringing Voss down alive. I've got one more example. This is an example of the kind of modern crossover between technology and history. This is the last 20 seconds of a recreation of the Werner Voss fight in the Rise of Fight Combat Flight Simulator computer game. I've got a link to it there to give due attribution. It has almost 300,000 views. That's not millions of views, but it's still more views than I think any video from me would get. So first of all, you can see it's the very end of the fight where Voss is out of control. And you can see we've got there that McCudden quote about how brilliant Voss is. I'm just going to play those last 20 seconds. If it doesn't show up properly for you, I'll narrate it through anyway. Voss is going down. Not really interested. I'm interested in how the person's represented it. As it hits the ground, he hits McCudden's description of the point the triplane exploded. Fade to black, fade out, and fade in. If I could only have brought him down alive. There it is again. Constantly bringing up this idea from Rhys Davids about bringing him in alive. So, why does the mythology represent it this way? Well, first of all, obviously, Voss has become a significant part of what's called the Knights of the Sky myth, and a lot of my work deals with the Knights of the Sky myth. Broadly speaking, it's this idea that First World War aerial combat was superior to other forms of combat in the First World War. It was a marriage of the latest in technology, but also with the idea that even though it was the latest in technology, it seemed to appeal back to these old martial values of chivalry and honor and respect, which the First World War seems to have lost because it becomes so industrial. And I say a lot of my work is on the Knights of the Sky, but I'm just going to take that as read. It's obvious what these talk of Lancelot and chivalry that Voss is fitting in to that mythology. I just want to make very clear this is definitely a mythology. It does not realistically depict First World War aerial combat at all. But I've got a different angle for the mythology of Voss that I want to talk to you guys about. And it's how Voss interacted with what I call the fighter pilot's dilemma. Fighter pilots, all pilots, wrote quite a lot about the war in the First World War. It was a new experience. Aerial warfare had never happened before. So when they were writing about it, they were describing something new. All people writing about war generally write in the context of how war's previously been written about. But it was a bit difficult for the pilots in the First World War because there was no prior body of literature about aerial warfare. So they were creating the whole thing. And then what we often find when pilots doing artillery observation or contact patrols or bombing or reconnaissance missions, when they wrote about their war, they displayed a great sense of satisfaction and that they were doing a skilled job that they thought was clearly making a difference to the war. A lot of First World War trench soldiers didn't really show satisfaction because they couldn't tell what the heck was going on. And everything seemed so isolated and weird and they felt so trapped. But these First World War pilots were very satisfied at being able to do this good job. But the fighter pilot couldn't do that because the fighter pilot could not tell what difference they were making. Their only job was to take off, kill other people, land again, next day, do it again, next day, do it again, over and over and over. And it never made any visible difference. They were meant to be trying to achieve something which was vaguely called mastery of the air or supremacy of the air. No one ever really defined what that meant. And they never achieved it. So as far as they could tell, the fighter pilots, they were just going up there every day, killing and coming back. And theoretically, they knew They were meant to be protecting their own side, stopping their own side being interfered with, the German lines, but they couldn't see that, not from their personal experience. And this goes to the broader point of what really was the point of the fighter pilots. Historian Peter Hart talked about Richthofen's funeral, which got so much attention. And Peter Hart says, who can discern any real effects of the death of even Richthofen? Indubitably, the greatest of them all. What difference did Richthofen's death make to the war? None. Fighter pilot veteran Stanley Walters, decades after the war, for the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, gave an interview in which he went into detail about this. And he said, we didn't do anything for the war, by two fellows fighting in the air and the loser going down in flames. He went into more detail, but that gets across the point. So what I found that when the fighters were representing their war, they were confronted by this dilemma. How do you represent a war when I can't see what the point of it is? I'm doing something, but I can't see what it does. So what they did is that they concentrated on the fighting. They made the fighting itself the point. You're up there to fight. And that's why they embraced these ideas like victories, score counts, aces. The ace system is such a weird system when you think about it. You know, Richthofen shot down 80 targets and is lauded as this hero. You know, a machine gun nest could take out hundreds in an hour, and no one would ever laud those people as heroes. But the fighter pilots focused on this, on the fighting and the victory and superiority being the point of what they were doing. To illustrate this, I want to compare the Voss fight with some other British martial mythologies, each of which shares one element with the Voss fight. So first of all, let's have a look at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. I know you're thinking, what the heck am I talking about a medieval battle for? Well, it's relevant. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, so I understand, makes a reference in the reports of that battle of a lone enemy who held off the English single-handed at a bridge, at Stamford Bridge, and put up this heroic last stand on the bridge before he was finally brought down. And the important thing about that myth is that he'd held up the advance of the entire army, and they couldn't get past him until they defeated this enemy. My second example is Erwin Rommel. That's another example of a German who's lauded, first of all, for being skilled, and secondly, for being honourable. Now, history has queried both elements of that. Was Rommel as good as the mythology says he is? Was he as honourable as the mythology says he is? But nonetheless, the mythology is centered around that idea. But the thing with Rommel is that he was obviously dangerous. Churchill made speeches about Rommel. Prime Minister doesn't make speeches about people that are not dangerous. We thought Rommel was possibly going to conquer Egypt, take our oil supplies, first in India. He was very dangerous. And another example, the Dam Busters raid, Operation Chastise in 1943. That's an aerial mythology I picked there. That's a similarity, focusing on one particular action. Now, again, history has a lot to say about the Dam Busters raid. You know, was it successful? Could it have been successful? Was it worth doing? But mythology is obviously very strong with it. But again, of course, the whole point of the Dam Busters raid has a very definite point to it. It's an instrumental raid. It has a functional value to destroy the dams. It's something to do. There's something at stake. With the Voss mythology, there is nothing significant at stake. Voss is not defending anything. He's not particularly stopping our planes from doing anything significant. Obviously, it's important for Voss. He died in this and the people whose lives were at stake. But like I say, we're in the middle of the Battle of Passchendaele. There's probably dozens of people died that hour, hundreds of people, thousands of people dying all around. In a war, that's not a reason to focus on the fight. And so I've got the idea that the Voss fight is an example of the fighter pilots solving the dilemma in representation. They've done so well at focusing on the fighting as being its own point that the Voss mythologies come to reflect this. We just value it because it's a fight. We don't really care what did it change, what did it do, what did it achieve. It's a mythology valued just for being a fight. And this is an example, if we come back to where I started, of how I say First World War aerial representation has avoided all of these negative myths of the First World War. I'm just going to quickly take you through some of these myths that have been named over time. These are courtesy of the historian Daniel Todman. The first one is mud. Now, obviously, aerial combat is clear of the mud. You're not in the trenches, but it's not just a literal mud. A mud has come to represent the First World War as a dirty war, as an unpleasant war, as a kind of horrible, vicious, brutal war with no honor. And it's all industrial and people being killed before they know it and going crazy. Well, the Voss fight, before it's talking about chivalry and Lancelot and bravery and honor and wanting to take him alive, it's completely taken out of the mud metaphor. It has no presence there at all. Well, another one of the First World War big myth concepts is futility, which the idea like battles like the Somme didn't achieve very much, or the whole war didn't achieve very much. But like I've just been saying, the fighter pilot's dilemma, this whole thing of looking at the battle just for the sake of the battle, has made the futility myth irrelevant. It doesn't matter, like I say, what it achieved or doesn't achieve. The fight just has to be fought well in this myth. So it sidestepped the entire futility problem. Or what about death? The idea that the First World War brought these huge unnecessary casualties. Well, aerial warfare as a whole was too small scale to get really into the death mythology. But even in particular, look at this Voss fight. First of all, no British people died. That's very easy for any British mythology. Well, Voss died, but even Voss's death in the mythology is redeemed. It's made positive by how brave he was and how well he fought. Those references earlier to saying he could have escaped but didn't. In the mythology, that's lauded. So, like, he chose that end. So it's not even a sort of negative death. And then, of course, there's that sentiment I have talked about taking him alive. If I could only have brought him down alive. So the Voss fight, I think, is a very powerful case study of the whole of the representation of the First World War aerial combat. It's clear of the disenchanted mist of the trenches, and it has this fantastic glamour and mystique, which the trenches will never have. And just as a side comment, I want to say, these mythologies, it's easy to call them lies. That's to kind of ignore how they work. Mythologies serve a purpose. We've always had a desire, all peoples, to find glamour in war. I don't think that's a controversial comment. We've seen so many films that in some ways glamorize war. There's a desire in us to find war is fascinating. War can be exciting. And obviously war is also absolutely horrible and terrible. But in representation, that's often ignored. Now, we can't do that with the trenches. The trenches have been absolutely closed off as a source for any sort of glamour, but not air combat. Air combat plays a role. It's a part of the First World War where it still can be remembered positively. And the Voss fight is at the heart of that. So that's how the Voss fight became this modern day mythology. But what I'm going to do now is just wind us back to how that happened piece by piece. Looking again at some of the points I've already brought up. So first of all, let's have a look at the 1930s and Ivor Jones. Ivor Jones did that Lancelot comparison, talking about how chivalrous and brave Voss was. Well, actually, what Jones was doing in his book, he was trying to find who was king of the air fighters, and he thought it was his old friend Mick Mannock. Now, Jones didn't really believe in aerial chivalry at all. Look at this line. Personally, I think it has been grossly exaggerated, for I doubt if any genuine chivalry was ever shown by rival airmen during combat. Now, James didn't think Richthofen could be king. And he has no idea that Richthofen was a master strategist, but he wasn't a master fighter. He weighed up the chances very closely before entering a combat, and the odds were against him. He believed in waiting. Unlike Voss, who would fight anybody and anywhere, the Baron carefully picked out his victims. Jones thought the German pilots were timid and defensive, like Richthofen, whereas Voss, he thought, was the one character he came closest to our concept of the ideal of the fighter pilot. Neither seeking or taking advantage of any surprise tactics, he attacked this formation of famous aces until he was himself shot to pieces and his plane a flaming relic. And here's the interesting comment. If the German airmen as a whole had been possessed of the Voss spirit, the story of the war in the air might have been differently written. I think that's an amazing comment, because he's basically rejecting Richthofen in favor of Voss, because he's saying that Voss's character is more important than Richthofen being good at his job. He thinks Richthofen wasn't glamorous enough to be deserved a scene in this way. I would say, rationally speaking, Richthofen was far more valuable to the Germans than Voss ever was. Voss was obviously an amazingly skilled pilot, but he basically threw away his life that day. Richthofen, who was careful, who was cautious, who picked his targets, who led his squadron to pick targets, who taught his squadron how to find targets, and they in turn taught other people. That's far more useful. But that's no good for this mythology Ivor Jones is building. He needed Voss to be this magnificent specimen of the airmen, and that to him made him more important. The problem is that this kind of mythologization of Voss has kind of lost track of who Voss really was. He's not, as Ivor Jones described him, Voss isn't a person at all. He's a symbol whose only job is to be the worthy opponent for us to fight. Now, can we query that? Well, I think we can. We don't know as much about Voss as perhaps we should, but we do have some clues. At the bottom of that screen there, I have a report by Voss, where it's a kind of piece of training advice he's given. You should not, said Voss, under any circumstance, attack formation to Sopwiths. And when he says Sopwiths, he basically means enemy fighters, which fly higher on the other side of the enemy lines. For you must then start the fight under unfavorable circumstances from the outset. So as far as Voss was writing about the war, he wasn't making out that he was some sort of like suicidal daredevil do or die type. He was advising a cautious approach. Well, here's another thing. On September the 23rd, 1917, Voss had only just come back from leave following a near-death experience in combat. And one of his colleagues, Larry Helpman, noted years later, he was on edge. He had the nervous instability of a cat. I think it would be fair to say that he was flying on his nerves, and such a situation could have but one end. Now, of course, he's talking there in retrospect. He's got the advantage of knowing what happened. But this is an angle that Ira Jones wasn't interested in. What if Voss was traumatized, suffering from combat fatigue, should not have been in the air in the first place, making mistakes? That's not this mythological Voss who boldly rushed into combat to fight everyone. That's a far more realistic idea. I can't prove it's true, obviously, but it's something that the mythology is built in the 30s, the worthy foe mythology, completely ignored. Was not at all interested in who Voss was, just how he could fit into the myth. So there's one last bit of the mythology for me to look at. I'm going to look at it in some detail. This idea of taking Voss alive, which, as we've seen, has been the centerpiece of the modern day myth. There's one problem with that quote, which is that it's not directly from Rhys Davids, even though everyone attributes it to Rhys Davids. Here's a sentence that appears. It is from McCudden's memoirs. Rhys Davids came in for a shower of congratulations, and no one deserved him better. But as the boy himself said to me, "Oh, if I could only have brought him down alive." And his remark was in agreement with my own thoughts. Now, this is McCudden talking about the fight months later. You have to consider whether this says more about McCudden than it says about Rhys Davids. They're saying, am I calling McCudden a liar, saying Rhys Davids said that? Well, possibly, but I'd certainly say from a historical point of view, we should be skeptical of taking a non-first-hand thing and just taking, we're so certain this is what Rhys Davids said. The only person we know for sure said it was McCudden when he wrote it down, and him saying that he agreed with it. So let's take it on the possibility Rhys Davids did say it. Bowman did say that Rhys Davids seemed depressed after the fight. Well, here's an example from Rhys Davids' combat report on the fight. Eventually, I got past and slightly above the triplane and made for it and got in a whole Lewis drum and a corresponding number of Vickers into it. He made no attempt to turn until I was so close to him, I was certain he would collide. A whole Lewis drum, that's the upper gun mounted on the SE5A that Rhys Davids was fighting, and also the Vickers, which is the lower gun. He was firing both guns at once. If he entered a whole drum, and Rhys Davids talks about reloading his gun twice during the fight, and he talks about firing into Voss more and more, even after he started to go down. At point blank range, I was so close to him, I was certain he would collide. And Voss isn't even maneuvering. He's not turning. He's not getting out of the way. He's not dodging. Rhys Davids is describing firing over 100 rounds into Voss's plane at point blank range. And he continued to fire them for as long as he could. There was never any realistic possibility of taking Voss alive. This idea that he might have seriously fought afterwards if only we could have taken him down alive, well, of course not. Not only did Rhys Davids unload hundreds of bullets into Voss, all the other people were firing at him as much as possible. This is not a criticism of Rhys Davids, incidentally. The idea that Rhys Davids was under some sort of onus to take a dangerous enemy down the line is nonsensical. This was wartime. He'd just seen Voss doing these amazing maneuvers and you couldn't get him. He made sure, in many ways, you might think he should be lauded for that. But nonetheless, it clashes with this idea about taking him down alive. Why might Rhys Davids have said this if he did? Let's have a quick look at Rhys Davids' mentality. Rhys Davids' hero was Albert Ball, the first famous British ace. Look what he wrote in April 1917 when he was just a novice pilot. He wrote lovingly of Ball. Ball brought down 2 more Huns yesterday, making a total of 7 in 3 days. This time he was alone against 15 Huns and fired away every cartridge he had on board. He deserves the VC 3 times over. Rhys Davids loved Albert Ball. Ball, rather like what we've heard about people like Voss and Rhys Davids, was a very, very brave man who constantly threw himself against large enemy formations of fighters and often came out on top. And many biographies of Ball portray him as a kind of sensitive, tragic figure, the innocent schoolboy, because he seemed so much like a schoolboy, who nonetheless did his duty. Some of his comrades are less sentimental. We'll see that Roderick Hill later described that Ball had but one idea: to kill as many Huns as possible. Professor William Fry called Ball a self-effacing, skilled, and dedicated killer. The problem with Ball's talent is that although it was great for Ball, it wasn't really great for the Royal Flying Corps as a whole. And historian Peter Hart noted that Ball's individualized tactics, they were brilliant, but they were beyond duplication by pilots who lacked his skills and suicidal bravery. This is the man that Rhys Davids idolized. Now, Ball died on a month into Rhys Davids' combat career. And then we see, how did Rhys Davids write later that month? I have taken 4 times the risk I ought to have done, and that by sheer luck I've come through the whole skin. In fact, I have been going on Ball's lines. He's talking both about Ball's kills, but also how dangerous Ball was living. And McCudden writing, he said about Rhys Davids, we had a second Ball in Rhys Davids, for neither of them knew the word fear. But there was a downside to that, and McCudden made that clear. I had some difficulty in making him realise that bravery should not be carried to the extent of foolhardiness. And there's plenty of examples in McCudden's memoirs of Rhys Davids taking risks, and at one point McCudden having to save him. Here's an idea of how Rhys Davids really wanted the war represented in a letter to his mother, and I think this is much closer to Rhys Davids' personality than this idea of taking Voss alive. One cannot lay down rules while on mere earth for people on fighting patrol in the air. You are a different man, or at least you aren't a man at all. That is, I am not. You are a devil incarnate, filled with the dazzling thrill of playing the best game God ever created. Mad after Huns and just forget everything else, but showing the old Hun that there's only one man fit to be in the air and not 2. That is what drove Rhys Davids. He was very committed to the idea of supremacy. Victory over the Voss was the pinnacle of Rhys Davids' career. It's the ultimate in proving himself to be the better man. So no surprise that he wrote for the fight so enthusiastically. And we laud this glory. We laud it in Ball. We laud it in Voss. And we've also lauded it in Rhys Davids. But of course, it has a cost. It was only just after a month after Voss died and a few miles away, Rhys Davids was seen diving to attack a group of German fighters. He was never seen again, and his body was never found. His name today is commemorated on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission on the Arras Flying Services Memorial in France. And it's my point, we laud this glory from Rhys Davids, but the mythology doesn't consider how suicidal this glory was, and whether this is really something we should be lauding, or whether it's some sort of terrible thing that some of these pilots were driven towards. So I think this makes a contrast to this Rhys Davids sentiment of taking Voss alive. But let's have a look at the person we know certainly did make the line, which is McCudden. And McCudden's lines, I've said before, they are the centre of the Voss mythology. Everything that came out started with what Voss wrote, what McCudden wrote. Now, McCudden was the opposite of Rhys Davids. He was a careful and considered fighter. He liked to stalk targets. He was a fantastic marksman. He could destroy targets at range in which not only had they not seen him, but they couldn't really fire back even if they could. And a great gift to me as a literature student, McCudden was also a very expressive writer, not just in his memoir, but also in his training materials and his combat reports and all sorts of things he wrote. He was very interesting to read, tells us a lot about the war, and he talks about a very practical means of fighting. Now, you remember I said earlier about this idea about how Rhys was depicted as the conqueror of Voss and not the killer. Now, this is part of what I call an almost conspiracy of language that people engaged in during the war to distance pilots from the idea of killing. This is a quote from the Canadian ace William Bishop, who went on to become the highest scoring Allied and Commonwealth ace of the war. But to me, it was not a business or profession, but just a wonderful game. Remember how Rhys Davids called it a game? To bring down a machine did not seem to be killing a man. It was more as if I was just destroying a mechanical target with no human being in it. As he constructed the war, he wasn't killing anyone. Well, McCudden was very similar. Whilst fighting Germans, I've always looked upon a German airplane as a machine that has got to be destroyed. And at times when I've passed quite close to a Hun machine, I've had a good look at the occupant, the thought has often struck me, by Jove, there's a man in it. So by default, they actually considered their war was won when they were not killers. And this language escaped into outside representations. I have an example here of Victoria Cross citations in June 1917, appearing in the London Gazette and the Times. Here's a grand example. Charles Pope, his sacrifice inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. His body, together with those of most of his men, were found in close proximity to 80 enemy dead. It's not glorifying in the killing per se, and he's been very brave, but it's focusing on the dead. Or on the same page, Sergeant Harry Cater, who killed the entire team and the officer of a machine gun nest holding up the advance. So they were not shy about, in Victoria Cross citations, of reminding you that war involves killing. Well, let's have a look on the same page of the Victoria Cross citation for Albert Ball, which was not given for anything specific, just for his combats in the air. It said that his combats left Germans out of control or forced to land. And in all, Captain Ball has destroyed 43 German airplanes. Not killed at least 43 people, destroyed 43 German airplanes. And this language was constantly distanced pilots from the act of killing. It was common in combat reports, communiques, medal citations, and press articles. And it holds for a very long time. The idea of calling someone's victory total their kill score didn't exist in the First World War, didn't really come to the Second World War, or even Vietnam. Constantly, First World War fighter pilots distanced themselves from the idea that they were personally killers. So when McCudden writes about taking Voss alive, it should be seen in that context as a kind of fiction that he uses as a coping mechanism to avoid the idea that he has to kill people. Now, another way that McCudden liked to write about his war, he loved the idea of skill. He was very skilled, but he appreciated the enemy's skill. When he was writing, he'd say things like, I was thankful, he talks of one instance, for if the German had only been a little skillful, I think he would have got me. He was all, even in his combat reports, he would talk about the skill or lack of skill of his opponents. Here's a good line. By Jove, that Hun was as dud as they make them, in one of his memoirs, talking about a hopeless enemy. But this next line is possibly the most extraordinary thing I've read about the war. I shot down a DFW, it's an enemy reconnaissance plane. This DFW crew deserved to die because they had no notion whatever of how to defend themselves, which showed that during their training they must have been slack and lazy and probably liked going to Berlin too often instead of sticking to their training and learning as much as they could while they had the opportunity. I had no sympathy for these fellows, and that is the mental estimate which I formed of them while flying back to my aerodrome to report the destruction of my 43rd aerial victim. Extraordinary comment. He's saying it's not my fault that they die if they're not skilled enough to defend themselves against me. I cannot think of any other part of the First World War when everyone wrote saying that the other side deserved to die because they weren't skilled enough. It's something very distinct to the air war, and particularly in how McCudden wrote about it. So now let's think about how McCudden is writing about Voss. Voss is very, very skilled, and he doesn't want to talk about Voss dying. And perhaps that is why McCudden put in that line about taking Voss alive, not because it was realistically possible, but because it suited his view of war. But McCudden gets more and more despondent as he writes his memoirs. Let's have a look at what he says about the war. He does not see it as a chivalric ideal. In my opinion, the Hun in the air must be beaten at his own game, which is cunning. I think the correct way to wage war is to down as many as possible of the enemy at the least risk, expense, and casualties to one's own side. Well, that's entirely sensible. That is the professional way to fight war. That's very different to this glorious view that Rhys Davids talks about. I hate to shoot down a Hun without him seeing me, because that's what McCudden did. He got his enemies from behind before they saw him. For although this method is in accordance with my doctrine, it is against what little sporting instincts I have left. Now, to me, I think that's the most significant line in his entire memoir for my work in general. For these people that make out the war as a chivalric endeavor, McCudden is blowing that apart with that line. Killing in that war, nothing to do with sporting instincts. But if we're talking about the Voss fight, I've got an even more important line. So much of the modern popular representation has zoomed in on this idea of leaving Voss alive. Well, here's what McCudden said later in the same memoir after he shot down another plane and he seized the dead bodies. We stayed by the Hun for some time, and the OT said that it was a pity we could not down Huns without this happening, because he's seen the bodies. And I agreed, so he agreed at the time, but when he's writing his book, I suppose I'm getting too sentimental. And one cannot afford to be so when one has to do one's job of killing and going on killing. Remember what I said before about how pilots try to avoid saying that they kill people. But there McCudden blew the whole thing wide open. And so everyone quotes this thing he wrote about taking Voss alive, but McCudden himself disavowed that. He went back and is saying, it is ludicrous to say take enemies alive. That is sentiment, and you've got to be professional. So in my opinion, the reason he wrote so positively of the Voss fight, it was the one moment where he could see the war as something glorious, like Rhys Davids saw it, even though he disowned it later. But it was, in many ways, it's too late. Even though he disowned it in the same book, the myth grabbed his glorious depiction of the fight and that line about taking Voss alive and ran with it. Of course, McCubbin's caution didn't actually save him from the war, because that is the way of the war. He was never defeated in combat, but he died in a simple takeoff accident on the 9th of July, 1918. So, I'm virtually done. I'm just going to go over what we've looked at. So the Voss mythology started with McCubbin's depiction, the sentiment of which was prioritized over anything McCubbin said later in his memoir. It was amplified in the 1930s by the romanticism attached to aerial warfare, and particularly this idea of Rhys Davids and the idea of him as the magnificent fighter against a worthy foe. In the modern day, it's increasingly become a way to help counterbalance the disenchanted narrative of the trenches, with popular representation focusing on this sentiment about taking Voss alive. And it still maintains a particular allure, even for me, but I think the myth obscures the reality of what happened in the battle that day and the nature of those who fought in it. And I just got one quick postscript. I've not uncovered any new material for this. This is all based on existing history. But I would say historical analysis of this fight has not changed the kind of romanticism attached to it any more than analysis of the futility myth of the trenches has changed that myth. I'm not trying to myth bust for its own sake. I think it's important that we should understand mythology. Very important. I think aerial mythology is fascinating. It still drives me. It's still my interest. To paraphrase Montgomery, I remain aerial mythology's unrepentant advocate. But I think it's important that, as well as enjoying aerial mythology, we should understand it. And even with my slightly cynical approach I've taken, there can be no doubt that whatever drove Voss that day, his performance and the entire fight are extraordinary. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to that. Thank you to Harry, of course. My thanks to Abby Whitlock, who's an up-and-coming expert on Rhys Davids, who shared some of her material with me. And I've got there a couple of the books there's lots of books I could quote. This is just the two best I could come up with. Alex Revell's book, Brief Glory, about Arthur Rhys Davids. Alex Revell is a tireless researcher of many of the details of the lives of the aces. And Barry Dickens' book, September Evening, which is a compilation of sources particularly trying to uncover what happened that evening to Werner Voss. I'm sorry, I've gone on for a long time there, because I tend to not very, very hard to stop speaking once I start, but I think we'll be okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Michael. It's a good talk. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed seeing you pull out some of the particular phrases which are attached to the fight, in particular the sort of ideas of bravery and brilliance, of flying skill, the refusal to flee, that etiquette of aerial combat that seemed to come through. But I was particularly struck by some of the points you made as you were sort of building up this analysis, in particular around that idea of sense of satisfaction or not that fighter pilots might be deriving during the First World War in comparison to pilots such as artillery observers. And I'm not sure I agree. So I'm gonna flag that up first, because I think it also it excised some of our audience members. So I think it's a good one to get into.
No,
which is, first of all, do we actually think that fighter pilots didn't understand their role, particularly how keen Trenchard was in pushing the importance of aerial supremacy? And on the other side, I mean, can we really say that they had less satisfaction than, say, a spotter for an artillery plane who can see and he's correcting the fall of fire? For, of course, at particular times, the artillery weren't as keen on cooperating. But later in the war, let's say, yes, they're cooperating fully, they can correct the fire, but there's not necessarily a real sense that you're really changing things, particularly when the front line isn't moving. So, I mean, I'm not sure I think that the framing that you have is quite correct there around satisfaction.
Okay, so I'll take that in two parts. So first of all, did fighter pilots have an appreciation of what their job was? Well, of course, they had a theoretical appreciation. And Rhys Davids even got a letter from his sister, who very perceptively basically asked him, why do you do what you do? And Rhys Davids had to write back saying, yeah, we're trying to get the mastery of the air. But it was one thing to have this theoretical idea about mastery of the air, the way Trenchard saw it. Their day-to-day experience made that invisible. They could not tell whether that mastery of the air has been, well, because it was never truly achieved. I say it was never even particularly well defined. They could not see what difference they were making to the war. There was no broader connection with the ground war below, which ironically enough very much helps in its representation, because the less that your representation connects to the trenches, the less it gets kind of poisoned by it, because the trench mythology over time has become very negative. So by keeping clear the trenches, their representation was given an advantage. So yes, of course they knew what the point of their job was, and some of them could rationalize it quite well. I'm never talking about everyone. It's just the way this mythology evolved. But mythology evolved from these fighter pilots idolizing just the combat as its own end and not having to think too much about beyond that. And that's really where most of the mythology developed from. As for the satisfaction of the artillery pilots, I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a couple of weeks, I should point out. That's it's a good challenge. I have a lot of direct sources of the non-fighter pilots giving direct lines saying how happy they were that they felt they were making a difference. And you got this quote from artillery pilot, sort of like almost weeping for joy when he watches the destruction below him as the result of his corrections. And it's something that you can't really compare after the First World War until I think the Gulf War, the video game war, those shots of watching enemies explode. He thought it was amazing the way he was watching this railway siding just explode as he was pointing out where to go. And a lot of these other pilots doing bombing and close support work, they give direct lines. I've got a direct line from saying that it's tremendously satisfying to know that what we are doing is of immediate help to the men below. They really like to connect themselves to the war and then making a difference to it. And that narrative is almost entirely absent from fighter pilot representations. There was one exception, which is a man named Alan Bott, who wrote the first ever significant piece of aerial literature called An Airman's Outings. He really, really tried to connect the fighter pilots to the rest of the war. He's saying this is how we should see it. He was very annoyed it didn't work out.
Okay, I think that's really interesting. There's several points that I really wanted to pick up out of it, but I don't want to monopolize the entire Q&A.
I am taking several controversial positions. I'm aware they're about shoehorning literature into a historical debate, basically.
I'll tell you what, I'm gonna pick this one up from Alan Ginman, and I'm going to add something onto it, I think. So Alan asks, could it be that the distancing from the idea of killing enemy pilots also helped to protect the pilots from the idea that they themselves could be killed? But I want to add this idea to you, which is how many people in the First World War actually did experience firsthand the practice of killing? I think we see it as, and it factors into another question I'd ask you, but we see the idea of the First World War as men in the trenches killing one another. In fact, we know that artillery was one of the main, if not the main, killer of men during the war, followed by the machine gun. And those machine guns aside, there aren't many people who are directly experiencing killing others on a regular basis. And surely that sets aside these fighter pilots in quite a distinct way.
I would absolutely agree. Obviously, I'm not an expert First World War historian, but as far as the experience of the First World War soldier is concerned, we've got kind of a split. We've got that Men Under Fire book by that American journal, I can't remember what it's called, when he's exploring the idea that it's actually really difficult to get men to kill. And on the other hand, we've got Joanna Bork in An Intimate History of Killing, where she talks about this kind of another forgotten part of the First World War, where some people, and it's completely against the mythology, really enjoyed going out there and killing Germans. But broadly speaking, yes, I absolutely agree. Most First World War soldiers had no direct experience of killing anyone. Very few of them got caught up close with the bayonet. That's why it's what I call this part of the fighter pilot's dilemma. The only part of the job they can understand is that it's their job to go up and kill people. And it's difficult to represent that. No one really wants to put it that way. So when McCudden gave that line about his job is killing and to go on killing, very unusual that a fighter pilot admits that. It's why it's such a powerful line. As to, sorry, the person asked if it protected themselves from thinking they were going to be killed. I would say that's almost certainly part of it. I would probably say most First World War soldiers probably found various ways to avoid thinking about the idea that they were going to be killed. So this was just done in a fighter pilot's kind of flavor.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. Yes, I was going to say the American is the Second World War, and sort of research at the end of it, isn't it? Where something like only 1 in 5. He does a study which is a bit controversial.
It's like controversial study. Like most of these things, it can be questioned. But
he says only 1 in 5 fire their guns. I think is what he's basically arguing, and it's used to drive the sort of move towards automatic weapons. And it's a really fascinating. I wish I could remember his name as well. It's a really fascinating study. But yeah, it's interesting to know whether or not that's true. But it's certainly interesting. Okay, we've got some good questions in. So this one is from T, who says it is difficult is it difficult to do academic research around First World War fighter pilots as there's so much emotion and myth attached to it? Are combat and intelligence reports, etc., a reasonable source, or are they still subject to bias and overcounting, etc.?
As far as overcounting is concerned, definitely there's a massive overcounting problem particularly with the British in the First World War, and the combat reports are pretty much the source of it. It starts with the combat reports. They're claiming all over the place. The combat reports are fascinating documents. Some of them are very clipped. Mick Mannock, for example, the British ace, he would write in a very professional tone. James McCudden wrote essays. He'd write essays, talk about how skillful the opponent was, talk about how brilliant he was. He would show off with the details. He would quote the numbers on the planes he shot down. And he has one quote at some point in his combat report. He's saying that, as far as I could tell, this guy went down at this grid reference, and so I can't quite get it right because I was busy fighting someone else at the same time, which is today what we call a humble brag. When he's this is actually him showing off that even when I was in the middle of another fight, I could see exactly where that one went down. That's how good I am. And these combat reports were not just showing up in his combat reports, they were reprinted in the official Royal Flying Corps communiques and distributed throughout the service. So McCudden was writing his own legend in the combat reports and having it broadcast throughout the RFC. So in no way am I going to take the combat reports as objective historical documents. But my whole thing, I'm an English literature student. I people that read like Shakespeare and Dickens and Austen. We're very used to looking at literature as a subjective phenomenon. And as I'm studying representation and myth, I will trust the historians to tell me the truth of things. I'm interested in seeing where the mythology differs from that truth and why.
I think it's very unwise to trust historians. There's a really great question here, I have to say. I think this is great from Jeremy Farrow, who asks, was there a class issue here? But it was okay for soldiers to do killing, but educated, higher class young men should be above such things, and it would be better for them to destroy machines. And I guess that fits in with McCudden using the term killing, given his background.
Indeed. This is a complex question. Because the class lines are not as simple as you think. I mean, the whole issue of class in the Royal Flying Corps is a very complicated area in of itself. And I know some other people that can probably speak to it more authoritatively than I can. But what I will say is that there's something slightly different in the Royal Flying Corps. One of the examinations of class in the war by Janet Watson examines how officers tended to look at war as a duty, something they had to do as part of their responsibility. Whereas a kind of working class or lower class or an underpaid soldier, they looked at it as a job, something they were being paid to do well. And that doesn't absolutely split on class lines, but it often does. The whole thing is that when you look at the Royal Flying Corps, that class distinction falls apart because those artillery observers and so on that I'm talking about, they characterize their war as work, not duty. And that's where some of their satisfaction came. And one of the things Janet Watson observed is that a lot of the disillusionment and cynicism from the war doesn't come from the working class things because their literature gets ignored. It's come from all these duty-bound officers of the middle and the upper classes who then later think that this duty they did in the First World War was wasted. It's thrown away. Whereas the people that just saw the war as a job were less inclined to be disappointed afterwards. And this connects to the war because airmen were far more likely to look at what they did as work, and in the case of fighter pilots, work that they often thought they excelled at. This changed their whole construction during the war. And this whole thing about fighter pilots scoring, as I say, such a ridiculous thing when we look at it closely. And that's before we get on to do the scores that actually bear any sort of accuracy. But again, it just represents the way they're looking at the war. War that you can have a scoreboard for. It's such an amazing thing. So there is a particular class issue in the Royal Flying Corps. Whether it was, did McCudden do it that way because he'd come up with a different class thing? I couldn't say that absolutely. I think I've got examples of combat reports coming from all different ways, from all different classes, from what I've looked at. But I'd have to collate them to look more closely at that.
Yeah, it's fascinating how that then connects on to the idea of sport. That idea that they don't see it as a job. So does that then feed into their depiction of this work as being a game, being sport, scoring, all of these metaphors that come in?
Definitely. I mean, the whole chivalric idea of Knights of the Sky and so forth, that's really not a pilot myth from the war itself. They were very unlikely. American pilots, they like to talk about Knights of the Sky. British pilots were very rarely talked about it in those terms, but they were very likely to depict it as a game, as equivalent of a sporting contest. Of course, you can analyze that throughout the First World War, but it's particularly acute in the aerial services.
Excellent. Okay. got a really good answer to a really good question. We have a question from Lawrence, which is, will this be available to rewatch afterwards? And the answer is yes. So that's nice and quick. There's another question from a different Lawrence, which is, are you able to see how the whole event was viewed from the German side, both pilots and public?
As in public representation. Right. So here is the gaping hole in my work. I can't read German. And that's been a real problem for me over time, because I'm looking at the close representation of language. Even if I look at translations, I'm looking at the language choices made by the translator and not by the German original. I think obviously we can't get a direct view of the fight itself because only Voss fought in it, and he's in no position to tell us what happened. There have been a number of comments. We know that Richthofen was very angry afterwards, and there's some talk about whether Richthofen thought that Voss had been abandoned by his colleagues. Voss is often was lauded as a hero, obviously just for his war work alone. There was a school renamed in his honor, although I think it was unnamed in his honor after the Second World War. I think we need that. We need more interest in the German side of the fight if we're thinking in mythological terms, because in the mythology, Voss has kind of been hijacked and turned into this symbol. And I think it would be good to get a broader representation of him.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he's fighting alone. It must all be very, very much picked up afterwards that one of their aces has gone down. So, I mean, is there much out there? That's what I guess I would ask.
I mean, there's the pilot of the red-nosed albatross. As I say, there's been a lot of debate about who that pilot was. There were, he would have seen some things, and we're fairly sure he survived. There were people that kind of bore some sort of witness to it. But there's all such a confused and weird arrangement. Even the British side, which has a lot of very close witnesses, it's very difficult to get two sources that agree in any substantial sense about what happened in the fight. So the actual events of the fight itself are difficult to get. The German view about how Voss was seen afterwards, that's definitely out there. He was definitely lauded. Problem is, I would say in the long term, Voss has been smothered by Richthofen, and that includes on the German side as well. So I think Richthofen wasn't that famous in the 20th century. He was famous, but he wasn't quite as famous as he was today. But the more time goes by, the more Voss has been kind of been erased by the legend of the Red Baron. So that's our problem there.
Okay. So we've got a question from Cornelia. Hello, Cornelia. Which is, had RD Rhys Davies not been quoted as wanting to take Voss down alive, would the myth have transcended as it has done?
Oh, that's a good question. Does it hang on Rhys Davies saying we should have taken him alive? Or at least McCudden writing that Rhys Davies said that we should have taken him alive. There still would have been a myth. I don't think it would have had quite the same sort of sentimentality as it has. I do think that is a very, very key sentence. But I say the important thing is that I don't think McCudden really generally meant it, because he contradicted it later. And yet it went on to become this big thing, which is often the way with mythologies.
Yeah, I guess if it wasn't perfect, then something else would have been, been the perfect myth to use, right?
Yes, absolutely. And McCudden comes up with so many good lines. There's always something you can hang on from what McCudden says.
Okay, so Sean's asked, he says, was there a connection between Blom and Voss?
Now, I might need some context for that question. It might have gone immediately out of my head.
Yeah, I think it's the Blom and Voss aircraft.
There is an aircraft company, Voss. Not directly that I'm aware of, but don't quote me on that. Is what I'd say.
Nothing springs immediately to my mind, but I was telling you earlier that I'm feeling fairly peaky, having just recovered from a cold. So apologies if I can't recall correctly. So I've got a final question from myself, and then unless we've got some more from the audience, I think we're gonna call it for that exact reason. And the one thing that I thought was really interesting is when you were picking out aspects of the mythology of the First World War, you identified death as one of them. And I'd question, is it death itself which is the mythology, or is it more this idea of a sort of pointless slaughter? And if we accept the sort of latter, but it's much more around slaughter and the futility of that slaughter, how does that connect into the Voss fight and this mythology? So it isn't a slaughter, but it is pointless. It's death, but that doesn't fit into this wider mythology if we're thinking about slaughter.
I quoted the myths separately. I said, mud is one, futility is one, and death is one. Obviously, that's a simplification. The myths interrelate, and so death and futility have a very close connection. People accept that people will die during a war, obviously, but death has become so much a part of First World War mythology. I think it becomes far less tolerated, for want of a better word, in stories about the First World War than it would be about anywhere else. And we often focus on individual deaths. Look how much Pat Barker made of William Owen's death in the Regeneration trilogy at the end there, in what I would say is not an at all historical version of that battle in which Owens died. So the death myth is based around the exaggeration. People casually say millions of British people died in the First World War, which is not true. It's still a heck of a lot of people, of course. So sometimes you say, that's why I'm sometimes cautious. Don't myth bust just for the sake of it, because I don't want to quibble about how many hundreds of thousands of people died, but it does get applied on the individual level. And I think the broader point is that that I'm trying to make is that all aerial mythologies evade the whole idea of death even being a problem. Even when we talk about the aces dying, it's always made out in mythology, not history. I want to make that distinction. In mythology, it's made out to be often a glorious moment, certainly in the press at the time, and often in their representations later. So any aspect of death, you can never get the exaggerated death for aerial combat because not enough people died. I mean, it's a few thousand airmen died during the war, which is a fraction of the amount of people that died in the first day of the Somme. It's a tiny number of people that die. You never had these newspapers filled with page after page after page of the dead with pilots. So it was disconnected from that myth in the first place. But I just want to say in particular, Voss shows is that death for air pilots becomes almost sentimentalized. As something superior. So it's the opposite of the normal death myth.
Yeah, I agree. There's something about the sort of good death transcending futility, isn't there? Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, I think we're going to call it there, Michael, so that I can crawl back into bed. I should tell our audience that we have a fantastic lecture coming up next week when it is Catherine Campbell will speak on Sholto Douglas. For those of you who don't know, Catherine is Sholto's daughter. And she's written a fantastic book on his life and analysing possibility that he was suffering from PTSD, or at least symptoms related to it, and breaking into his background and his more personal experiences to really unpack some of the sort of Second World War knowledge that we have of Douglas and the controversies he's associated with. So I'd encourage you all to register for that lecture. The book itself is very good, well worth reading, and I'm sure the lecture will be fantastic. It's also a good opportunity for me to tell everyone that the RF Museum's academic awards have opened. So if you have done a BA and MA in the last 2 years and would like to apply for our dissertation prize, please do so. And if you are currently completing a PhD, such as Michael, you are very warmly encouraged to apply for the bursary, which is worth £1,500. And finally, our conference is on the 5th and 6th of September. You can attend in person with tickets starting at £35, which gives you access to both days, and the conference reception at the end of day one, which is being very kindly funded by the Society for Military History. And with the price of wine in London, you could probably drink your money back quite quickly. So I'd encourage you all to attend in person if you can. But if you can't, you can watch all of the papers live on Crowdcast using our Crowdcast channel, and I'll post links. And you can also rewatch them at a later date. So having got all of that out of the way, Michael.
I'll just point out at that conference, there's a couple of interesting speakers, maybe on near the start of the day.
There's a really good panel at the first day, which features you, Michael.
Which does, yes. If you're not bored with me, I'm back again in 2 weeks' time talking at the conference. So.
Yep, on a different theme, I should say.
Indeed.
So, well worth tuning in. But yes, all that's left for me to say, Michael, is thank you very much for what's been a very engaging talk. I think I really enjoyed hearing your ideas around how this mythology of aerial combat has been brought out. So thank you very much, and thank you to our audience. Okay, well, thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.